let's in fact begin with this evening's key points on Viewpoint. Thank you so much for staying with us. I'm Rihatul Siddiqui. So very good evening and a warm welcome. Now, the G20 under India's presidency has adopted a consensus declaration on issues facing the bloc. This was the big announcement that was made by Prime Minister Narendra Modi during the summit today. Now, after over 150 hours of intense negotiations, the negotiators from 20 countries finalized the language on the Ukraine conflict. This morning, in fact, the Prime Minister inaugurated the two-day summit by calling on the members to end a quote-unquote global trust deficit and also announced that the bloc was granting permanent membership to the African Union in an effort to make it more representative. And despite divisions in the grouping over the Russia-Ukraine war and China's ambitions in the Indo-Pacific and the South China Sea, the press conference organized just a short while back had a positive story to tell, especially so as during the summit in Indonesia in 2022, the group was deeply divided over the war in Ukraine, as the declaration then had noted that while most nations condemned Russia for the invasion in Ukraine, there were also divergent views. But the word that came out this evening from the likes of the Sherpa of G20, Amitabh Kant, and the External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, was that the Delhi Declaration was one that had 100% unanimity, and it did not come with any sort of a footnote. The leaders went on to add that this has been the most ambitious presidencies in the G20 history, especially after India assumed this presidency in the troubled times of the geopolitical conflict. The day that started with Prime Minister Narendra Modi inaugurating the Group of 20 Leaders Summit, sitting behind the Bharat placard, piquing the interest of many, also saw a series of bilaterals that the Prime Minister Narendra Modi had on the sidelines of the summit with the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and also the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida.
खुशखबरी मिली है हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर्स समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी।
All G20 member states have come to New Delhi with a strong sense of responsibility about addressing the most pressing global challenges. Speaking for India, we are clear that no one left behind.
Under the guidance of Honorable Prime Minister, India's G20 presidency has worked for the theme One Earth, One Family, One Future.
And before I bring in my guests on the broadcast here on Viewpoint, we are getting some more breaking news. Remember, I just spoke about the bilateral that the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had with Narendra Modi, and now there is word coming in from 10 Downing Street. It has in fact tweeted, the leaders, partners and friends, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and Prime Minister Narendra Modi met today at the G20 summit. They in fact discussed the close and growing ties between UK and India, and in fact had a productive conversation on work towards delivering the United Kingdom-India Free Trade Agreement. Remember, this was something that was much talked about. This was something that was the need of the hour. This conversation had started in January in 2021, and on the sidelines of the G20 summit, they were looking at reaching some sort of consensus when it was about the UK-India Free Trade Agreement. And there, that word is coming in from Downing Street. Possibly a consensus has been arrived at, and possibly a conclusion will be arrived at very, very soon. So it's a positive sort of an outcome that has happened after the leaders met on the sidelines of the G20 summit. We'll be speaking more about that and all of that transpired today on day one of the G20 summit. Let me open this up to my guests who join us on the broadcast this evening on Viewpoint. Gurjeet Singh, who's a former diplomat, is with us. Also with us is Professor Brahma Chalani, who's a strategic affairs expert. Also with us is Fred Vaya, who's a Russian affairs expert. And also with us is Richard Haniana, who's the president, the Center for Study of Partisanship and Ideology in California. We'll, of course, be getting us another speaker in just a short while who will also give us a democratic perspective from the Washington, D.C. Remember, the all-important bilateral with President Joe Biden also happened yesterday with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Let me actually begin with the first guest that I had announced, Mr. Gurjeet Singh. Mr. Singh, the all-important corridor announcement has just about happened. It's a historic step. It's also talking about how this will alienate China further. What do you first make out of this huge announcement that's coming out of G20?
Thank you. So I think this is stupendous. And we have had in the past announcements about Build Back Better, the Global Gateway, the India-EU connectivity partnership, but there was never a project to go with it. So today you seem to have a project which will go with all these ideas together. So the crux lies in, can we get our procurement systems aligned? With China, that is never a problem because it is one entity. But I have studied trilateral cooperation for long now, and I find that the major problem is how to align your procurement systems. And that is what we will learn to have to do. What is the role India will play? Certainly our market access would be very important.
Yes.
But I think Indian companies would have a great role to grasp EPC and construction contracts in getting this done because they have great experience in both West Asia and Africa. So I think that part could do very well. But please, let's be cautious. Every time there's a G20, a lot of announcements are made. The last time in Bali, they promised Indonesia $20 billion for a just energy transition. A year down the line, not a dollar has flowed. So, we're extremely optimistic, extremely happy, but I am still cautious. I would like to see plans come into force. It's a good move to have the project.
Okay. Professor Chelani, would you agree to what Mr. Singh has just said, considering this is being considered as one of the more ambitious counters to China's infrastructural projects? Would you consider it so, or would you also wait for something to happen on ground first?
I would be cautious simply because this is a memorandum of understanding among the US, India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other nations to, quote unquote, explore a shipping and rail corridor that will stretch from India to Europe via the Middle East. The economic feasibility of this project will have to be examined very carefully. So there are a lot of things that need to be examined before this project can take off. And this project initiative is not part of the G20. This has emerged on the sidelines from the discussions that leaders of America, India, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE were having. So the G20 summit by itself, however, has an important message about China's colonial style lending. China has been pursuing death trap diplomacy, which has ensnared a number of nations in Africa, Latin America, and Asia in a Chinese debt trap. To counter China's predatory lending, the G20, in its consensus document, has agreed to reshape the World Bank, increase its capacity to lend to the poorer countries, lend money for infrastructure projects. So making the World Bank a larger institution geared to helping poorer countries address their infrastructure challenges is an important step and a clear signal to China that it's not going to be the only game in town.
Okay. Let me actually bring Mr. Fred here. Fred Vire, I'd like to understand from you, and we are going back to what we started with, talking about the joint declaration. A consensus has been arrived. The announcement that came out of G20 Day 1 today was this is with 100% unanimity. There has been no footnote. There has been no discrepancy whatsoever. Of course, it came after a lot of deliberation. China and Russia were at the center of it all, considering their presidents were absent from the G20 summit this year. in India. Now, with this announcement of a rail and the rail corridor coming in very, very close to that announcement of a joint declaration coming in, how do you juxtapose the two? How do you read the joint declaration and also this conversation about alienating China that the corridor announcement will be making?
Well, first of all, I think India is to be congratulated
Yes.
For navigating that situation, and especially the passages on the Ukraine war. It certainly will be received not with satisfaction, but with equanimity in Moscow. And there's nothing there that will bother them. And I'm sure their delegation signed on to it easily enough. It means that that bullet has been dodged as far as Moscow is concerned, because it has been a constant feature of all these meetings, that this contention over the Ukraine war and the insistence on both Western countries and Russia in making that the central issue all the time. And in this case, they've been sidelined, both the United States and Western countries and Russia has sort of been gently pushed aside in favor of bigger issues that are of concern to the global majority. And I think India really navigated that well and brought those issues front and center. Beyond that, I don't think there's anything about that will all the results of this meeting will be warmly welcomed in Moscow. I don't know Beijing. I'm not a Chinese expert, but Moscow won't be bothered by any of it. They have their own plans in Africa, in Latin America. They also have their outreach plans. They're more modest than the Chinese ones. For instance, if we're speaking about transport corridors, Russia is heavily involved in the transport corridor from Iran up through Azerbaijan to connect with the Russian rail network that goes both east and west from there. I think that's underway. There's a section of railroad still to be built in Iran. So there's more than one transport corridor going on in the world.
Yes.
But
Fred, it's not just about the transport corridor, and more than Russia, I think China should be more impacted because this talks about alienating China further. What I like your views about would be the joint declaration per se, because if we actually, read through the lines and actually declassify the text that has come out, in fact, from the declaration, there has been a lot that's been said, including the fact that human suffering, negative impact on food and energy security must be avoided. They're also talking about the use of threat of nuclear weapons, which is completely inadmissible. They also talk about refrain from use of force for territorial acquisition. How do you think Moscow is going to be reading those statements?
Yeah, I don't think the Russians will like some of them, but they are cropping up everywhere. International law is there; it exists. Most countries, and even Russia, when you're talking about a different subject than Ukraine, agrees with those principles. But on the whole, I don't think that it will like, if you're asking what would it impact, it won't disturb India-Russia relations, for instance. I think they're just fine. China, I don't know whether China feels isolated or not. I don't know why President Xi didn't come to the G20. Perhaps he had his reasons. I think Putin just didn't come because he was worried about this contentious animosity erupting over the Ukraine war, and sitting in the same room with Joe Biden probably didn't suit him. But otherwise, and it should be pointed out too, that Russia is very enthusiastic about some of these alternative formats, like the BRICS, which India is also a member of, which they find more amenable as forums, because there are no Western countries there for pushing agendas that matter to Russia. And because of the situation right now in the world, Russia is very focused on geopolitics to the expense of almost everything else.
Okay. Richard, let me bring you in here. I want to understand, if we go and talk further about the declaration that has come out specifically about two important bilaterals that Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, had with the Prime Minister of the UK and also the President of the United States of America. How much of that would be which possibly would have had a bearing on what has come out of this joint communique?
So I think the other guests are correct to focus on sort of the shadow of China throughout this event. I think in the West, there's been sort of a narrative shift since COVID-19, in which China has they've started to become more pessimistic about the future of China. China is in some ways seen as more threatening. At the same time, I think it's lost some of its sort of reputation for competence. The economy has slowed the way they handled COVID. China was always seen as at least competent and rising. And I think a lot of that has, got away a little bit. And I think in contrast, the stock of India has risen. I think India has done really well the last few years. Chinese birth rate has collapsed while India, has passed it in population. And so I think that there is sort of a mutual interest between the West and India right now in order to really sing India's praises, to sort of bring India into a global leadership role. Now they are not, they're not, their interests and their ideas about the world order are not completely aligned. And so you will see things like Modi will, wants to bring African Union into G20. There's, disagreements about things like that. And Ukraine, of course. And so they've got to work these things out. But overall, I think the conference has been, just good for both sides, and they're getting what they want out of it. And yes, the role of China in the world is always in the background.
Okay. Professor Chalani, they say the devil is in the detail. If we break down the statement that has come out of the 83 paragraphs, I believe more than 8 have been dedicated to the geopolitical conflict. And this was what the bone of contention was, especially after the presidents of Russia and China decided to skip the G20 summit in India. When you actually read through the statements that have come out, how do you see that being read by China and Russia? And when we talk about that relationship, both the External Affairs Minister and so also the G20 Sherpa, Mr. Kant, had reiterated this one aspect, that among the G20 nations, it was the G20 emerging economies like Brazil, like South Africa, like Indonesia. They were the ones that were responsible at arriving at this consensus. So how does one read that statement?
First, I think the G20 has traditionally been a Western-dominated organization. The West, plus its allies like Australia, Japan, and South Korea, make up the majority of the membership of the G20. So bringing in the African Union has been a very important step in making this organization more inclusive. If the European Union can be a member of the G20, certainly the African Union was certainly qualified to be a member of the G20 too. So in that sense, India has succeeded, at least by including the African Union, in making the G20 more inclusive. You mentioned about Russia and China leaders being absent, but the fact is that Xi Jinping and Putin didn't come, but their delegations were there. The Chinese premier was here, and they participated in the deliberations. They were party to the consensus document that has emerged, the New Delhi Declaration. So this declaration definitely embodies the agreement of all the group, the entire group, including all the 20 member states of this group, this bloc. But it's important to remember one thing, though, that on the contentious issue of Ukraine, India managed to secure consensus and help adopt this broader document by avoiding casting blame on anyone for the war that is raging in Ukraine. For example, if you look at what the Bali Declaration said, the Bali Declaration had very strong language. It deplored in the strongest terms, it said, deplores in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine and demands its complete and unconditional withdrawal from the territory of Ukraine. That was the language in Bali. That language is missing from the New Delhi Declaration. Instead, the New Delhi Declaration on Ukraine conflict just begins by mentioning the conflict, the war in Ukraine, and then talks about general principles. Principles like avoiding the use or threat of use of force, or refraining from changing borders by force. So these are general principles. And by emphasizing the general principles, India played a very important role in helping this bloc reach consensus on the larger economic and climate change challenges that the world faces.
Okay, we will also be talking about the climate change aspect of it all, but if we actually go to Mr. Gurjeet Singh, the entire G20 summit day one today started with the Prime Ministerial address and also him sitting behind the Bharat placard. That was something that had in fact generated a lot of eyeballs, and many critics believe that in a global forum making a political statement was sort of uncalled for. However, the others are of the view that whatever India decides to call itself, it's an internal matter. Internationally, it will be picked up as is projected. What are your views of that, considering that started the G20 summit today? And then further, we can talk about the all-important challenges that, the climate change needs to be actually dealt with.
So on a day of which is perhaps the high point of Indian diplomacy since independence, we are talking about the placard, we are talking about China and Ukraine, which are not the main issues. The main issues is turning G20 towards humanity. And we have brought to bear the responsibility of the emerging countries and the global south onto the G20 and made them listen. Now, what India calls itself is India's business, and our constitution clearly says India, that is Bharat. Secondly, India has persuaded all that the Ukraine crisis needs to be downplayed and not allow big power rivalry to overrun the G20. So I think that is a success, and the biggest success was to bring in the African Union right at the start, showing that consensus building is going to dominate the New Delhi G20. And as Mr. Chelani said, the weight of the expectations and responsibilities towards the global south is the sheer importance of this G20. And now if you look at the biofuel alliance, you look at the infrastructure, you look at the digital public goods, you look at so many initiatives, you can't count them. Those are the real successes. I really wish we would focus on that than the absence of a Chinese leader or what they didn't do. As the foreign minister said today, every G20 country contributed to the declaration, and we have their concurrence. That is the success of India and the G20 today.
Absolutely. And Fred, this point that Mr. Singh was making, I'd like to have your views on that, considering India is being projected as the big brother to the global south. How do you see that projection? Like Mr. Gurjeet Singh was mentioning, at the very onset of the summit was the announcement of inclusion of the African Union into the G20. It will be a group of 21 nations now, with the African Union also now standing included. And this, of course, offers more inclusivity, considering the G7 was expanded into G20 for this very reason. And that is an important posturing at the start of the summit. How does one see that?
You're talking to me?
Yes, Fred.
Yes, I think that is a very bold move, expansion. It is an expansion in that multipolar direction. Certainly Russian and Chinese leaders favor. And I think it also is a move to democratize the G20. It will, I think, broaden the participation and empower the global south more. I mean, we are living in a world where the tectonic plates are shifting, and we're going to be, within a very short period of time, living in a very different world in terms of global economy and also the distribution of global political power. And so I think India stepping up and promoting this expansion was audacious, but it also really pushes that shift faster and more in a direction of creating a world where formerly disempowered people have a voice. How would that be received in Moscow? I think they'll be all in favor of it.
Okay. Richard, I'd like to understand from you the one point that also came out, and if we go back to this joint declaration, was also the important need of countering terrorism. There was a conversation, especially if we cater to the bilateral that was between the UK Prime Minister and the Indian Prime Minister. There was one aspect of counterterrorism that was discussed, I believe, also with the United States of America. And that also forms an important aspect of what is the communication that's coming out of G20. How does one read that, Richard?
Yeah, well, the terrorism issue, I think, is connected to the African issue that we just talked about. Most of the terrorism of the world in the last few years, most of the deaths and most of the destruction has moved to Africa from the Middle East. The extent to which, it's good sort of PR for India. Yeah, India has always done things like this, going back to the non-aligned movement to, try to raise the voice of the poorer countries in the world. But Africa, it's an open question how much they would be able to contribute to something like the G20. There's been half a dozen countries in Africa that have had coups within the last 2 years. Their governments are very unstable, in part because of the terrorism issue. So it's all connected. To be able to bring Africa into the G20, to give Africa more of a role in global institutions, is going to require stability, and requiring stability is going to require dealing with the terrorism issue, which is really ravaging the northern part of the continent.
All right. In fact, before I come back to my panel of guests, I request all you gentlemen to stay on with us. We are getting some more breaking news from the G20 summit. We would play out that. There's in fact a tweet that has been posted by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He in fact has tweeted that history has been created with the adoption of the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration. He's talking about the joint declaration that has been with 100% unanimity coming out of the G20 right ahead of day 2, that is tomorrow, of the G20 summit. United in consensus and spirit, he further goes on to write, we pledge to work collaboratively for a better, more prosperous and harmonious future. He further goes on to say, my gratitude to all fellow G20 members for their support and cooperation. That's the word coming in by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. India as president of the G20 has achieved a very, very important aspect with this mutually decided upon communication that has come about from the G20 summit right on day 1. Remember, the entire conversation was around it, and India has managed to achieve it right at the onset of this G20 summit. I go back to my guest now. Professor Chalani, I'd like to understand from you, there was of course, a lot that has happened through the way of bilaterals that are happening on the sidelines of the summit. And of course, there are various aspects that are being discussed regarding India's positioning. I was asking that question earlier to Mr. Singh as well. India as a leader to the global south, India as a bridge between global south and the global north. How do you see that posturing really coming out of G20?
Priya, as you know, the world is getting more divided. So we have one divide between Russia and China on one side and the Western bloc on the other side. And then there's the Western clash with the rising global south. India is trying to play the role of a bridge builder, which is a very important role, because if you heard Modi's statements today when he was addressing the 2 different sessions of the G20, his messaging was, to rise above other leaders who were talking about advancing national interests He was talking about advancing the interests of the entire humanity. So India is trying to play the role of a bridge builder by seeking to focus attention on pressing global challenges. This is not an easy task given the growing international divisiveness, but you're right that India is trying to position itself as a country that is willing to broker deals to help advance international interests. But at the same time, India is also seeking to advance its own economic and geopolitical interests. Example, Prime Minister Modi had more than 15 bilateral meetings with leaders attending the G20 summit. More than 15. So he was quite busy over 2 days, engaging with leaders on the margins of the summit. But it's important to note that he did not have a formal bilateral meeting with one leader. That was the Premier of China. It was a snubbed China that he did not have a formal bilateral meeting with the Premier of China.
Right.
There was a time, when India was holding bilateral summit meetings.
No, absolutely. And that's an important communication, Mr. Chelani, Professor Chelani, that's coming out. And that is the positive note that we'd like to, in fact, leave day one with. It was very, very important for India to make that announcement. All eyes, in fact, were on that. And to bridge and narrow down the conflicts and come out with a joint declaration becomes absolutely important, and that's why India's position really gets strengthened in the global aspect, and that's something that we would like to look at. On that note, I'd like to thank all my guests for joining us this evening on Viewpoint. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation.